Hi students. This is my attempt at providing you a lecture format where you can work independently. This format allows you to take notes and listen at your own pace. I recommend that you take notes on each of the slides, especially where gaps of understanding of the curriculum occur. Most of our upcoming exam on Chapter 8 will draw from material found here within this PowerPoint and material from the textbook, so it will help you to take this assignment seriously. This chapter lecture will begin with a discussion of the political organization of space. But first, I think it's important for you to know how this material ties into the AP Human Geography curriculum, and more important, how it fits into the upcoming AP exam. I also feel like it is very important for you to know why you are studying what we are studying, making connections between what you are learning and the reasons why we are asking you to know this stuff. So over the next few slides here, I'll be talking about the enduring understandings and the curriculum that you'll be picking up. Essential questions, etc. So at this time, you don't need to take notes until I tell you. Enduring understanding, how do we get here? By the end of this section, you will understand that the contemporary political map has been shaped by events of the past. The essential question, how do spatial political patterns reflect ideas of territoriality and power at various scales? By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the territoriality and power by analyzing boundaries, the politics and economics of spatial relationships, explaining how geopolitical forces influence it, governance, and local versus metro patterns. One of my favorite quotes is, "Humans see what they want to see." Rick Riordan, who wrote The Lightning Thief or the Percy Jackson books, if you know those, said this, and if you think about it, just remember that much of this course is based on perspective and scales. Just like our visual ability, our political world operates in many different perspectives, each with its own unique characteristics. So in this example here, your yard, neighborhood, your town, your country, my world, and my home, depending on where you're standing and what you're thinking about. You will also be able to discuss how globalization challenges state sovereignty. You'll be able to apply the concepts of centrifugal and centripetal forces at the national scale. These should be terms that you remember we talked about previously. Now on to where I would suggest you take notes. Remember, you have the pause button in front of you, and I'll go slow so that you can get all the information. So how is our world organized? In political geography, it is the study of political organization of the world. It's how our world is shaped and who determines borders, etc. A state is a politically organized territory with a permanent population, a defined territory, and a government. We'll be going over this in great detail in a moment. The modern concept of territory arose in modern Europe as a system of political units emerged with distinct boundaries and independent governments. This is the idea of territory or ownership of a particular place is really more of a modern concept. This process is called territoriality. Territoriality is simply the process by which we determine distinct political boundaries and can study how and why they emerge or emerged and how they emerged as they have. Sovereignty. The term sovereignty is relatively easy to understand. However, in practice, it's a tough one to measure. The definition here is a recognized right to control a territory both politically and militarily. So think about it. For instance, we would all probably agree that each country has a right to do what it wants to, and most of us may say that they can do whatever they want to do as long as it does not impact me. So take, for instance, the example in a smaller scale. What if your neighbor, who has sovereignty over the house and property next to you, decides to paint his or her house pink? Or let's take it further. What if they decide that they want to burn their garbage nightly in a barrel that's right on the edge of your house? That is, by the way, upwind from your house. All right? So now backing out, imagine that a country like China decides to pollute their waterways. We may say that it's okay because they have sovereignty. However, where does the water end up? How about pollution from factories, etc.? These sorts of sovereignty issues are examples that do not even touch upon human rights issues. For instance, should a sovereign nation be able to execute anyone it wants simply because it's a sovereign area? Human rights and other issues are often not as easy as one may think. Think of the military. This also seems like an easy concept. But then think again locally. Do you want your neighbor walking next to the fence that you share while carrying a machine gun? He or she may say that they are doing this to defend their territory. But the point is that you should understand that these issues are bigger than we often consider from an academic term standpoint. Under international law, states are sovereign, and they have the right to defend their territorial integrity against incursion from other states. Looking at this map here, notice that most states in the Western Hemisphere gained their independence between 1750 and 1939. States in yellow, independence in or after 1940. So I'll repeat, hint, hint, that most states in the West gained their independence between 1750 and 1939. The modern state idea. The idea of the state appeared in various forms across world regions 400 to 500 years ago. The European state idea most influenced the development of the modern state system. Emerging political state was accompanied by mercantilism, which led to the accumulation of wealth through plunder, colonization, and the protection of home industries and foreign markets. The Peace of Westphalia. This was negotiated in 1648 and marks the beginning of the modern state system. In the Westphalian system, it also became territory that defined the society. Territory is treated as a fixed element of political identification, and state defined exclusive, non-overlapping territories. So, terminology. This is very important in this chapter. So when we look at the term state, I want to be clear here that state equals a country. This is not the same thing as states in the United States. Do not think in terms of the state of Tennessee or the state of California. Rather think in international terms, as this has a very precise meaning. We will use the word state when we study the modern political map. We'll talk about it as we get there. To be a state, you must have a defined boundary, contain a permanent population, be recognized by other states, and maintain sovereignty over its domestic and international affairs. Hint, hint on this slide. So, to be a state, you must have boundary, contain a permanent population, be recognized by other states, and maintain sovereignty over your domestic and international affairs. So I like to use acronyms, and use of acronyms is helpful to me. So let's remember this as BPRS, beepers. How about that? So boundary, population, recognized, and sovereignty are the things that need to happen. So what's the number of states, or how many are recognized by the United States? Total of 195. And keep in mind, how many of them are recognized by other countries depends on their own internal decisions to recognize or not recognize a state. So we recognize 195. If there's a question on your test that says around 200, that would be the one I would select. So cue music here. If we were going to do a Jeopardy quiz, which I'm not going to make you do, let's use the beepers test here and look at Taiwan. Is Taiwan considered a state? Does it have a defined boundary? Yes. Does it contain a permanent population? Yes. Does it maintain sovereignty over its domestic and international affairs? Well, no. China calls Taiwan a renegade province. Is it recognized by other states? By only a few, but not all. Therefore, Taiwan is not a state. How about the United States? Well, looky there. So using beepers, boundary, population, sovereignty, and recognized, we would say what? Well, there's an argument that some people say we are and some people say we are not, but in this case, for this course, we will say the United States is recognized by all. So what is a nation? Let's move to this idea of nation. A nation is simply a group of people who have certain things in common. This is the Seminole Indian village around 1920s Tamiami Trail, not far from where I used to live. So a nation. Nation is a culturally defined term, and few people agree on exactly what it means. The term was originally meant to refer to a group of people who think of themselves as one, based on a sense of shared culture and history, and who seek some degree of political territorial autonomy. All nations are ultimately mixtures of different people. A nation is divided by its own membership. Therefore, we cannot simply define a nation as the people within a territory. So let's look at some of these. A common heritage, shared values and beliefs, claim a traditional homeland, and desire for self-determination are what equals a nation. Now compare the definitions of state and nation. So we'll look at the next slide, but which is more restrictive? In other words, which criteria are harder to meet? Is it harder to meet the requirement of being a state or of a nation? And then we're going to look at how many states are there. And then we're going to look at how many nations do you estimate there are. So let's use our tests here. We'll use beepers on the left to be a state, boundary, population, recognized, and sovereignty. And to be a nation, common heritage, shared beliefs and value, claim a traditional homeland, desire for self-determination will make you a nation. So let's look. Which is more restrictive? Well, in this quiz, the answer is state. The criteria is much harder to meet to be a state. You need boundaries, you need autonomy, you need a sovereignty, and all the other beepers things, remember? Anybody can call themselves a nation. One of the examples I always use is the Cherokee Nation or the Seminole Nation. They may not technically have a border, they may not have an exact location, but it is a nation they consider themselves. Number two, how many states are there? There are 195 states as recognized by the United States. And how many nations do you estimate there are? There are from a few hundred to a few thousand, depending on different scholars. So you can see that even though we want you to have a full understanding, even the experts can't give a definite answer to this. So there are some nations and some state examples here. Nations are the Kurds, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and the Catalans, which are in Spain. This is a group of people that won a homeland in Spain and have been fighting for that for a long time. And then in states, there's Belgium and Nigeria. They have distinct territories, and they meet the beepers acronym that we talked about earlier. So now let's move to the next term, which is nation-state. This is a combination of the two terms we looked at earlier. However, in this case, it's its own term with its own meaning. A nation-state is a politically organized area in which a nation and state occupy the same space. The goal of creating nation-states dates to the French Revolution and democracy. Key problem associated with the idea of the nation-state is that it assumes that the presence of reasonably well-defined, stable nation living contiguously in discrete territories. In reality, that's not true. When people have a strong sense of nationalism, they have a loyalty to and a belief in the nation itself. A state, in contrast, seeks to promote a sense of nationhood that coincides with its own borders. So in other words, using my example before, I could feel a sense of the nation of being a member of the Cherokee Nation or the Seminole Nation, even though we don't have a distinct border. The state, though, tries to define it by saying, all right, well, you live in this reservation, so this is your state or this is your area. So those are two distinctions among those. To help people with the borders relate to the dominant national idea, states provide security, infrastructures, and goods and services for their citizens. So states try to build this feeling that we are part of a nation and try to build nationalism, but do it in ways such as protection, economic, and military, etc. A nation-state is a singular nation of people who fulfill the qualifications of a state. They meet both criteria. Can you name two nation-states? Cue the Jeopardy music. Was that in Japan, something like 98% of its 128 million citizens are of Japanese origin. And Icelanders make up 95% of their own population. So how would the United States rate? As you can see, this would be very difficult. Our nation is built upon a mixture of many different people. So then we move to multi-state nations, multinational states, and stateless nations. So let's look at these. Nearly every state in the world is a multinational state, a state with more than one nation inside its borders. When a nation stretches across borders and across states, the nation is called a multi-state nation. When multiple nations or states claim attachments to the same piece of territory, you can imagine the potential for conflict is significant. Another complication that arises from the lack of fit between nations and state is that some nations do not have a state. They are what they call stateless nations. Here's an example of the Kurds. As you can see, the majority of Kurdish population live between a border that's shared by Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, a little bit in Armenia, And so these people do not have a country. So looking at this green is not a country. This is a nation of people, and these people are considered members of a stateless nation. So let's look at the terminology and the variations on a theme. So multinational state, just the description. Let's look at Canada, Quebec, the Inuit in provinces of Nunavut. Let's look at autonomous regions. This would be people like the Swedish people in the Åland Islands. Finland won't let them become independent, but grants autonomy. Stateless nations. So this is Kurdistan, Palestinians, the Basques, also in Spain. And then the multi-state nation. So Hungarians living in Romania, if you remember the part in your book in the text, they talked about that. So let's talk about European colonialism and the diffusion of the nation-state model. Europe exported its concepts of state and sovereignty and the desire for nation-states to much of the rest of the world through two waves of colonialism. During the heyday of colonialism, imperial powers exercised ruthless control over their domains and organized them for maximum economic exploitation. Despite the end of colonialism, the political organization of space and the global world economy persisted. So let's take a look at this map, and you can look at the dominant colonial influences over 4 centuries. So 1550 to 1950, and you can see the various influences that were based on countries. So you can see Great Britain influence here, and Portugal here. You can see Turkey all the way down into Saudi Arabia. Denmark had its own, Russia as well, all through here. So it's a very interesting map that kind of shows you the influence in Spain as well. You can see Spain on the South American coast. So this is just an example on the map of showing you what the colonial powers were doing and who was dictating what was happening across the world. Construction of the capitalist world economy. One of the most powerful impacts of colonialism was the construction of a global order, characterized by great differences in economic and political power. The concentration of wealth that colonialism brought to Europe and parts of the world dominated by European settlers. Colonialism is at the heart of highly uneven global distribution of power that continues even today. So what are the possible consequences of the uneven global distribution of power and wealth today? Well, let's look at these 3 basic tenets of the world system theory here as Immanuel Wallerstein, and what I would tell you is know these, all right? Hint, hint. So number 1, the world economy has one market and a global division of labor. There is capitalism. In the world economy, individuals, corporations, and state produce goods and services that are exchanged for profit. This is the American system. Commodification is the process of placing a price on a good, service, or idea, and then buying, selling, and trading that item. And you know we do that every day. Number 2, although the world has multiple states, almost everything takes place within the context of the world economy. Colonialism played a major role in establishing this system by exporting the European state idea and facilitating the construction of an independent global economy, interdependent global economy. That simply means that we all rely on each other. Even though there's individual states, if one economy, say Japan, goes down, it impacts the United States, China, etc., the rest of the world. And then the world economy has a 3-tier structure. There's the core. Core is where one is most likely to find higher levels of education, higher salaries, and more technology. There's the periphery countries, processes associated with a more marginal position in the world economy. They're strong powers, but not necessarily so strong economically speaking. And then there's the semi-periphery, places where core and periphery processes are both occurring. Here's a map to just give you a general idea. So we usually look at the west part of the world, Europe, Australia, Japan, as the core country. Then when you look at semi-periphery, you can look at Mexico, Brazil, India, China. And then the other on the periphery, you can see Africa, Soviet Union, etc. Now, that being said, there are some major concerns of the world system theory. This clearly overemphasizes the economic factors in political development. So think about this. It doesn't account, for instance, for North Korea, who may develop a nuclear weapon. So economically, they may not be powerful, but they may militarily have significant power over those other periphery countries. So it's very important to understand that. It's also very state-centric. The idea is that it's only looking at the state. Remember, we are a world made up of nations as well, and states, and nation-states. So individuals within a particular country may also be very wealthy, but it doesn't account for that. And then it also does not fully account for how places move from one category to another. It takes one little act economically for a country to go up and down very rapidly, and it does not also account for globalization. The impact that the idea being just the United States as a core country certainly can't operate on its own. It relies on China to borrow money and buy goods from them. So clearly globalization is not something that they thought about. So this slide here, no notes required on here, but just consider if you were going to build a nation, and they're looking at Africa or Asia as an independent, that corresponds with borders, how would you do this? What education, what government, what military, what culture would you set up to build your nation? And keep in mind, this makes the pretense that you understand all of these different areas and you have understanding of what the outcome will be based on what you're doing. We're going to watch a video later that's going to illustrate how many African nations were exposed to the, quote, end of colonization, but then left to kind of carry the bag themselves. And we'll watch a video related to that here in the next day or two. So key questions. How do states spatially organize their governments? There are centripetal forces. These are forces within the state that unify people. We're going to go over examples in a second. Centrifugal forces are forces that divide them. A state constantly exists depending on the balance between centripetal and centrifugal forces. So here's some examples of forces that divide. This is centrifugal. There's separatism in a region. There's the North versus the South, for instance. The internal boundary conflicts. So different places, let's take an example of Florida and Georgia. They're always fighting over where water runs, who gets the rights to a river that runs one place or another if it's diverted. Then there's deep religious divisions as well that can pull apart state people in their regions. Then there's centripetal forces. These are ones that unite people. Examples here are unifying symbols like a flag, the National Pledge of Allegiance, language, religion, cultural traits. These are all things that pull people together. It's that commonality. So let's look at terminology again. We want another term here, that's nationalism. That is a nation's desire to create and maintain a state of its own. Nationalism is a unifying centripetal force. Let's look at another one. Centripetal forces unify. Examples more are shared religion, external threats. It pulls the country together if that country thinks that they're being attacked or going to be attacked by another country. And then common language. For instance, all Japanese people speak Japanese. Imperialism. So these are some terms that we need to know to make sure we move forward. This is a very broad term for one country bossing another around. That's my simple way to describe it. It can include culture, economics, politics, etc. And colonialism is a type of imperialism in which people move in and settle the land. I think both of those terms are ones that you are familiar with. There's a timeline of colonialism, which is early colonialism before 1800, countries of Spain, Portugal, then France and Britain. And then the later colonialism period, 1800s and after, that is Britain, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Germany. So forms of government, you need to know these as well. There is a unitary form. Unitary is a centralized states whose administrative framework is designed to ensure the central government's authority over all of the state. This is an example that I would say of a unitary is a centralized, is a lot of the Soviet bloc countries, China. Those are very much unitary. There's one person or one body typically that in charge of the country, and it's a centralized government. They don't have states that work similar to ours, which would be more like the federal system. In the federal system, the regions have much control over government policies and funds. And in a weak federal system, the central government retains a significant measure of power. Federalism accommodates regional interests by vesting primary power in provinces, states, or other regional units over all matters except those explicitly given to the central government. Devolution. Devolution is the movement of power downward from the central government to regional governments within the state. An example is the UK, Northern Ireland Assembly, a parliamentary body, resulted from devolution. Sometimes devolution is achieved by reworking a constitution. In other places, the government devolves power without altering constitutions, almost as an experiment. So let's talk about electoral geography. The very first part is partitioning of state territory into electoral districts. This is an effort to denationalize politics and allow regional input into the political process. Electoral geographers examine how the spatial configuration of electoral districts and the voting patterns that emerge in particular elections reflect and influence social and political affairs. 1994 South Africa vote was a dramatic vote that will be discussed later. Number 3, geographers study patterns of voting behaviors to assess the influence on their geographic situation. In other words, do people vote a particular way because of their immediate geographic location? Number 4, reapportionment. This was a term we used before. Remember, the census happened since 1790, every 10 years, that divides the House and the House of Representatives. So remember, the census is where we do an actual enumeration or a count of our population. Why do we do this? Remember, people move, and for elections to be fair, the pool of representatives based on the population needs to be as fair as possible. So that's why we do it every 10 years. So that's what reapportionment is. Key questions: how are boundaries established, and why do boundary disputes occur? A boundary between states is actually a vertical plane that cuts through the rocks below, called the subsoil, and the airspace above. So it's all the way up and all the way down. Hint, hint, for a question. It goes beyond just the geographic. So only where the vertical plane intersects the Earth's surface on land or sea does it form the line we see on the ground. That's the vertical plane of a political boundary. But understand that countries own above and below. States typically define the boundary in a treaty-like legal document in which actually points in the landscape or points of latitude and longitude are described. Literally says, in some cases, from this tree to this place or whatever. Cartographers delimit the boundary by drawing it on a map. In either or both of the states so desire, they can demarcate the boundary by using steel posts, concrete pillars, fences, walls, or some other visible means to mark the boundary on the ground. So keep in mind, that's called demarcation. So when you demarcate, you're marking where your property is. That's familiar to many of you, maybe at your own home. You may have a fence or a rock wall or something that demarcates this is your property line. Geometric boundaries are drawn using grid systems such as latitude and longitude or townships and range. Physical political boundaries follow agreed upon figure in the natural landscape. So in other words, the center point of a river or crest of a mountain range. That's how they use it. They literally would use from this tree to that tree, something along those lines to shape the boundary. Types of boundaries here. There are boundary disputes that I want to talk about here. When we look at the 4 definitions, please have an idea of what these are. The first is definitional boundary disputes, focus on the legal language of the boundary agreement. You said we had from this territory to that territory or that tree to this tree. Locational boundary disputes center on the delimitation and possible the demarcation of the boundary. The definition is not in dispute, but its interpretation is. So what is the fence? Where is the rock? Et cetera, that demarcates our line. Operational boundary disputes involve neighbors who differ over the way their border should function. So should it be an open border? Should it be closed border? Should we have a fence? Should we have a wall? This is familiar right now when we look at Mexico and the United States. And then allocation boundary disputes are becoming more common as the search for resources intensifies. So this goes back to waterways. What if there's a river that flows between 2 countries? Who owns it? Who gets to control it? So here I want to look at the shape of these states. There are 5 specific ones listed here. They all make sense to me in terms of if they showed up on a test. Look at this one. This is prorupt, or what I would call protruded. And so this state is whole here, but then protrudes out here. Hungary, if you look at it, it's just compact, right? It's simple, easy to design. Elongated is Chile, is an example. Fragmented is the Philippines, multi-makeup of islands. And then perforated is, there's portions here, 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 here. That is, perforated is South Africa as an example. And why do these matter? Well, in terms of governments and trying to control what's involved in their state or their nation, imagine you're Chile and you're the leader of Chile and you have only 100,000 soldiers to protect your whole border. Where do you place your soldiers? Do you line them in a row at the border? Do you put 100,000 here? Do you put 100,000 down here? It makes it much more difficult. Where in Hungary, you could distribute them much easier. So that's just an example of one reason why it's important, not even speaking of the economic. You want to build a train system, it runs all the way from here to here, much harder than in a smaller country, much harder in a fragmented country, etc. Okay, to keep control over the people. Here's genetic political boundaries. The leading mid-20th century political geographer, Richard Hartshorne, reasoned that how boundaries function is affected by how they came into being. He came up with a fourfold genetic classification, which is here in front of you. Number one is the antecedent. This one predates the development of large-scale politically organized communities, for instance, between Malaysia and Indonesia, where its border passes through a sparsely inhabited rainforest. So that's the section we're looking at here. Then there is the subsequent, or B. This reflects a long-term process of adjustment and modification. Over time, this border between Laos, Vietnam, and China has changed dramatically. So it's very important to note that. Superimposed, that's down here between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. These are often drawn by outsiders and are sometimes contested by groups straddling the border. This one has no, if you look at it, it's an island, right? So we really should have one country here, and instead, somebody's drawn a line here. And this line, interestingly enough, actually straddles right down the middle is the rainforest, which is kind of a line of demarcation. And then you have a relict. A relict is an old boundary, a boundary that has ceased to function. So we look at Vietnam here. North and South Vietnam are connected today. But this was a border that was fought between the United States and the North Viet Cong and China, if you will. So we were fighting this border for a long time. And even though the countries are now united, this border is still there. There's still border stations. There's still evidence of it on the cultural landscape. Okay, so how does the study of geopolitics help us understand the world? Classical geopolitics, late 19th, 20th century geopoliticians were usually either part of the German school or the British American school. Let's talk briefly about them. The German school tried to explain why certain states were powerful and how they became powerful. Friedrich Ratzel, influenced by Darwin, said the state resembles a biological organism whose life cycle extends from birth through maturity and ultimately decline and death. So the idea is here is no matter what your definition of the country is, over time it will flourish, it will grow, it will flourish just as almost like a human life cycle, and it will die regardless of what is done. The British American school, this is Mackinder, and this is the geographical pivot of history, was land-based power, not sea power, would ultimately rule the world. So this was a change from the explorer era where sea power was most important to ultimately who owned the land was ultimately more important. And there's an acronym here, NATO, the North American Treaty Organization here, and this is a very interesting group, which we will talk about this a little bit later. I'll kind of skip it now. But this geopolitics is a term that often comes with negative connotation. There's this critical geopolitics, which is the intellectuals of statecraft constructed ideas about geographical circumstances and places. These ideas influence and reinforce their political behaviors and policy choices, and then affect what happens and how most people interpret what happens. For test purposes, I want you to know that some geopolitical geographers refer to these actors in the powerful states or the core states as the intellectuals of statecraft. The idea is essentially that the leaders of these countries, in essence, shape perceptions of various places on Earth. For instance, Ronald Reagan coined the term evil empire to describe the Soviet Union during the Cold War, while also calling the United States a shining city on the hill. So the idea is here that that will, in essence, shape how people view the Soviet Union. You know, the Soviet Union is, at the time, a dark, cold, evil empire that we must fight. So when we're looking at this, I would tell you as a hint, think of American presidents are typically seen as, whether we agree or not, intellectuals of statecraft. So that term, if it shows up on your exam, would be one that is tied to American presidents, is an easy one for you to get the points, all right? I'm going to go to unilateralism here. This is just one country, example, the United States in position of dominance, while other countries following its lead. We typically found ourselves as a unilateral power, especially after World War II. Although our dominance and position in the world has faded, we still are seen as a unilateral power. When we do something, it typically trickles to other countries, or we're followed most likely by other countries. Everybody waits to find out what we're going to do. Then there's a new world order, the global cooperation to bring discipline to rogue states. So it's the idea of, let's say with Russia now, if Russia's beginning to be more assertive, they're trying to take different territories. Even though the Cold War may be over, what are we going to do and how are we going to stop that? Nuclear weapons also can invert the power structure. So thinking of North Korea, how do we fight North Korea if they have a nuclear weapon, and who helps fight them? And fighting doesn't necessarily mean militarily. It could be economic. It could be political pressure applied. It could be us working through a third party to try to influence politics. Supranational organization. 3 or more states, hint, hint, 3 or more states that forge an association and form an administrative structure for mutual benefit and in pursuit of shared goals. So these are supranational organizations. That means the United States, Mexico, Canada get together and they do something like NAFTA. They work together. Why is that important? Well, in some cases, it's hard for countries to want to give or usurp any of their power up to somebody else. So imagine the United States, Canada, Mexico, that's 3 countries get together. Now there's 3 votes. What if the other 2 countries vote for something we don't agree with, right? So it is giving up a little bit of power, but why do countries do it? Well, it's typically down to economics. It's in their own economic best interest to do something like that, to join. Typically they do it for economic terms, although many times it's military for protection as well. The history of this global supranationalism started with the League of Nations in 1919. Hint, hint, League of Nations 1919 was the start of supranationalism. And you can look at organizations like the United Nations, UNESCO, World Trade Organization, et cetera, as examples. And then there are regional supranational organizations, the Benelux, the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was what we did after World War II to try to help countries build their economy back up. And then you can look at the European Union as also an example of a regional supranational organization. After the Marshall Plan, the OEEC formed and then ultimately became the EU. So this is just a slide about the EU. Think about Europe and all these different countries that are so close together. It's much like our United States and Georgia, North Carolina, et cetera. But imagine you're traveling from Florida to, say, Kentucky, and everywhere you go along the route, everybody had different money. And that means you stop to get gas in Georgia, and there you're using Florida dollars, so then you have to transfer that into Georgia dollars, and then so forth and so on as you move to Kentucky. That is not very economically advantageous. So clearly the EU wanted to get together, the European Union, and try to figure out a way to have a national, if you will, a supranational monetary system so that it made it simplified for everybody as they did to do their economic trading. Okay. How does economic affect the state? Let's look at deterritorialization. This is globalization network communities that undermine the state's traditional territorial authority. In other words, it is harder and harder for states to maintain true borders and to secure them. Not meaning only in a defensive way, but also in terms of popular culture, religion, economy, etc. You know, how can the United States say that we are just the United States when we get music and art and even people that move from different countries here? So it's very difficult to say what an American actually means, right? So it's much more difficult. And then reterritorialization is trying to build borders to combat globalization and the loss of territory. So it's a state moving to solidify control over its territory. So if we say, wait a minute, I don't feel like we're a state anymore, or we're losing the state feel, countries are bound sometimes to want to try to close off their country or build walls, or give an example in North Korea. They don't want any music, and Saudi Arabia doesn't want certain internet websites and things like that available. So, and certain movies, etc. So, this is a way for these countries to try to make it back to just the state as the primary. So now we're looking at the colonialism wave 2. This is the early 19th century and beyond. And most important here is just to know that the colonizers were Britain, France, Netherlands, Belgium, and Italy, and the colonies were Africa and Asia. Look at colonial Africa in the late 1800s. Look at all these different people that had influences. So these are all different countries influencing. So look at the English colony. You can see German colonies filled in here, French colony as well. So all playing a role. About what I'm trying to say here is that if you look at all these different places that have influence, the French, even if they left, still had a vast influence over what was happening in that territory. Now then we look at civil wars in the developing world. 1960 through 1970, 32 colonial territories in Africa gained independence. So that's a win, right? But remember, these territories were states, not nations. So in order to be a state, you must have the BPRS, right? We talked about it before, boundary, population, recognized, and sovereignty. Let's take an example in Africa of Rwanda. Rwanda was a superimposed state that was united, in quotes. You had two different tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis, two separate people, although they looked the same, two separate people in terms of their religion and their culture and what they believed in, etc., their faiths. So when you look at the Hutus and Tutsis, they were different ethnic groups. They weren't a nation. So what they tried to do is basically put two groups of people within the same country. And as many of you know, this did not work. So if you know about the Rwandan tragedy, it's a horrible thing, and people were killing each other. And mostly this was still a takeoff of the colonial impact of making these false or fake borders. And these are called fake states. These are states, in quotes, with superimposed borders that mean nothing. It'd be like if somebody came to the United States and carved out, Louisiana and Georgia and Kentucky and a couple other states and then said, okay, everybody that lives here is now a resident of New Mexico or something. It just doesn't make sense and doesn't fit. And the culture and identity of the groups were different. So looking at Rwanda in 94, Rwanda gained its independence, but it led to almost 1 million deaths. The Hutus killed the Tutsis and the moderate Hutus on a vast scale. And it was genocide organized, and they were targeting why? Because of their race, religion, ethnicity, or nationality. But really, the people were from the same place. It was only because the borders were drafted differently. Rwanda is an example of the problems that occur in a multinational state, one state with more than one nation. Recall, too, that generally one nation tries to dominate. We'll look at civil wars. Let's look at Kurdistan, the ethnic Kurds we talked about earlier. They are a stateless nation. There are between 25 and 30 million Kurds spread across Turkey, Armenia, Iraq, Iran, Azerbaijan, and Syria. And this is, again, going back to that slide that you saw earlier, just a different graphic of the same thing. These are different groups living within there. So then we have the Cold War. We know about the Cold War, the U.S. and the USSR, or the Soviet Union. And it happened from 45, and around 1989 to 91 is when it started to go away. But there's still proxy wars. There are wars being fought in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, but neither were really between the United States and Soviet Union, but yet the United States and the Soviet Union were supplying people in that area that were fighting each other, even giving troops, etc. The front line for the Cold War was Europe. And our Eastern European countries were satellite states, so East Berlin, East over, all those countries were all satellites and satellite states of the Soviet Union. And then for the United States, the Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, we know about those places that we've been. Germany itself, after World War II, was split between the West and the East. The Soviet Union took over the East. The Americans and the West took over the western part. And as you know, it took many, many years for that to come back. There was a wall built that actually people were killed if they tried to cross it. So that's an exact example of a place trying to build a state and a nation within one aspect. After a while, the United States, the USSR split back into Russia, and the satellites become independent republics. So all those countries in East Europe became independent. But today, we have what they call a European refugee crisis. So what we see here is groups from all different parts of the Mediterranean, the North Africa, etc., moving in to different areas distinctly. And you can see some are part of the European Union and some are not. But this is a crisis, clearly, and it's a crisis on a lot of fronts. So after the balance of power shifted, after the collapse of communism and the Soviet Union, that shifted the power balance in Europe. Both NATO and the EU, the European Union, grew, absorbing many of the former Soviet satellites. Russia appears, though, today to be attempting to return to its former position and strength. In the Caucasus, for instance, in Georgia, 2008, and in Ukraine, Crimea, they're wanting to get access. We're going to look here at how geography may play. So you're the Soviet Union, and you want to trade down here. Well, the only way for you to trade, unless you go all the way around here or all the way around here, is to go directly through here. Look here in Crimea area. Look at here. This is the Russia. If they didn't take over Ukraine, you see why it's so important for them to get a hold of Ukraine and Odessa, because this allows them to trade with all these various countries. And then if you look here in the Bosphorus, it's so important for them to have this because, and this is Bulgaria, as you know where my wife is from, the Soviet Union wants access here through the Black Sea. Why? Because as they come through here trading, they trade and they'll come through, and this is the Bosphorus here. This is right where I'm pointing to here, over here. They come through the Sea of Marmara, and then they go through, and then they're in the Mediterranean, and they have access to all the European market. Okay, so it's all